Hello, everyone. My name is Mark McCaffrey. I am the co-chair, co-focal point of ECOS, the United Nations Climate Change Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholders Community. And I am talking to you from rural Hungary, about an hour outside of Budapest. Unfortunately, I have a barking dog in the background, and I will keep my comments very short and sweet. But we're pleased today to have Christina Kwauk share with us some of the research and insights that she has put together in a paper that I think many of you have seen on quality education, roadblocks to quality education in an era of climate change. And so I think many of you are familiar with Christina's work and her bio. So I think without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Christina.
Great. All right. I will now share screen if you would give me a moment. I know I just did this a second ago. But Mark, I wanted to thank you not only for your invaluable inputs into the report, which this presentation is going to be based on, but also for welcoming me into the ECOS community during this incredibly important year for climate action. So I wanted to just say thank you for that. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Good to go? All right. All right. Okay. So I wanted to begin first by laying out some of my assumptions, because I understand that I'm coming to the topic of climate change as a relative newbie. I am a social scientist trained in the anthropology and sociology of education. So I study education systems and particularly specializing in non-formal education delivered by NGOs, especially for marginalized and vulnerable girls in low and middle income countries. I am currently a fellow at a think tank based in Washington, D.C. called the Brookings Institution, where I lead our work on girls' education and gender equality in education more broadly. So I began researching the intersections of education and climate change about 4 years ago, when I became aware of the disproportionate impact that climate-related disasters was having on girls and women around the world. And since then, I have been conducting landscape and policy analyses looking at national attention to girls' education and climate change, which led me to see a bigger problem in climate action, which is that the education sector writ large is a key actor missing in climate-related discussions and decision-making. So I have since caught up relatively on action for climate empowerment discussions, but I admit that there is much more that I can learn from, learn about and from, especially those of you who have been in the space much longer than I have. So I wanted to start off here in this presentation, letting you all know that I'm going to be focusing primarily on the formal education sector. So this is the K-12 education system as it is delivered by governments across the globe, as well as their supporting community of actors like teachers unions, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and so on. I recognize that ACE has a much broader remit when it comes to non-formal and informal education, capacity building, technical training, public awareness, etc. But my point of departure is in the formal education system, where I believe the bureaucratic structures and the processes that hold up the system mean that the education sector is not as nimble as is required to catalyze the degree of transformation needed for the planet. So I hope during the discussion, you'll be able to help me extend some of this analysis of the formal education sector to the non-formal and informal spaces. I'll also refer quite a lot to ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, which I'm using as an umbrella term to include things like climate change education. That also includes, climate science, or it includes, a broad set of education-related sort of activities around sustainable development and climate change. So I'm using this term because this is a term that UNESCO uses if and when it does refer to things like climate change in education. So I think this audience is well versed in the research that points to the importance of education for climate action, so I won't go into the research around why we need to focus on education. As I mentioned earlier, my point of departure today is whether the education sector is standing up to the task of climate action, and the short answer is no. Not a surprise to any of you, I think. But the long answer is a bit more nuanced and the focus of the remainder of this presentation. So the most obvious reason why is a lack of leadership. So while both the UNFCCC and UNESCO, which is the UN's de facto education arm, while they both recognize the importance of education and climate action, the education and climate communities have remained siloed and have done very little to advance coordinated education for climate action for, by, or with children. At the micro level, school teachers and school administrators may recognize the magnitude of the problem, but because taking action, like condoning student participation in climate strikes, would run counter to school attendance policies or jeopardize assessment outcomes or upset some parents, what often results is no action. Where there has been action at the local level, these efforts are often isolated and dependent on the initiative of individual pioneers or local level advocacy. At the macro level, global education leadership by UNESCO has led to, I think what many would say, a dilution of a rather robust field of environmental education into this quote unquote education for sustainable development that has become in a way untethered to the planet, completely devoid of any capacity to actually transform our ways of being and thinking in the world. And on the climate side, the UNFCCC has also fallen short on its Article 6 aspirations to lead climate or action for climate empowerment. So just take, for instance, despite the Doha Work Program, just over half of parties have designated a national ACE focal point to help strengthen coordination of ACE activities. And if we look at the 5 largest nations in the table on the right, which together account for nearly half of the world's population and more than half of global carbon emissions, only one country has an ACE focal point. And a shout out to Mark also for bringing this to my attention. So this lack of leadership doesn't affect just the education system, but it also means that other sectors like energy, transportation, waste management, they don't also understand fully the transformative potential of education, nor how to strategically leverage education entry points. So for instance, in a recent analysis that my colleagues and I did over at UNICEF and Plan International and Brookings, we conducted an analysis of 160 NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and we found that if education was referenced as a climate strategy, it was framed in one of, or more than one way, but in 4 ways primarily. The first way was as a general awareness raising activity that enabled the success of a non-education sector's climate action strategy. So for example, emphasis on education in order to increase recycling behavior that would help reduce plastics to landfills. Another way was that education was framed as a positive outcome made possible by the success of another sector's climate mitigation or adaptation strategies. So an example of this would be children having better access to school as a result of an electrification program that was fueled by renewable energy. A third way was framing education as collateral damage in a weather-related disaster. So for example, schools are no longer accessible because of tidal waves washing away coastal schools or something like that. And then finally, education was often framed as a sector in need of development that would improve the adaptive capacity of a country's population. So looking at this sort of as a demographic sort of indicator where increased levels of literacy might increase the population's capacity to understand things like early warning systems. So such a conceptualization of education misses the mark when it comes to action for climate empowerment because it essentially overlooks the transformative potential of a quality education for children and youth that is centered on issues of climate justice and ties together self, social, and ecological awareness. So what explains why the education sector has not stepped up to become the game changer it needs to be in climate action? So the analysis that this presentation is based on a critical review of literature, a landscape analysis of the climate change and education for sustainable development fields, as well as interviews with a number of climate scientists and education stakeholders. So from this analysis, I've identified sort of 5 major roadblocks, all of which, if addressed, can also serve as strategic on-ramps for the education sector to accelerate climate action. And so these roadblocks are competing priorities, a lack of radical vision, problem of definition and scope, a poor monitoring and accountability system, and lack of support for teachers. So I'll go into each of these further now. Okay. So first, when it comes to competing priorities, the global education community, which I'm sort of using as a term that includes a sum of all the local and global education actors who don't always often view themselves as a single cohesive community, which is important to note. When it comes to competing priorities, the global education community has a long list of priorities, both for governments, civil society, implementers, donors, the whole gamut of actors when it comes to supporting countries to deliver basic education services. And in a time where we're addressing a learning crisis, this becomes even more of a set of competing priorities. It's also, it becomes difficult when you have education systems that are still struggling to ensure that all children, especially girls and refugees and displaced communities and other marginalized communities, have access to education. So as a result, ESD is often framed as complementary to, rather than fundamental to the vision of education, and as something that is in addition to, rather than integrated throughout the school curriculum. And this ultimately leads to the separation of sustainability learning outcomes from academic learning outcomes. And this leads education systems to really have to end up choosing where they spend their scarce resources. So driving this problem is the second roadblock, which is a lack of radical vision for education. So earlier in this millennia, the UN led efforts to reorient education towards sustainability with the UN Decade for Education for Sustainable Development. Yet analysis of these efforts point to an underlying failure of any ambition actually translating into critical reflection and transformation of the education principles, values, and practices that have contributed to our current climate crisis. And this includes any education about sustainable development and climate change being centered on individual action and behavioral change rather than collective action and structural change. An overemphasis on consumer capitalism rather than social and environmental justice, and the dissociation of economic practices from their social and ecological consequences. As a result, in their attempts to align education for people, or align education between people and planet, learners are positioned as separate from the non-human world, and adult success is defined by one's ability to control and dominate and exploit that world. Today, unfortunately, the majority of students who are actually in school are not learning. And this is according to standardized assessments in basic academic subjects. So, take that with a grain of salt. So global education discussions about the learning crisis are often framed in terms of children's inability to do basic math, to read, which affects their ability to become productive adults. And the aim of the education system there is to prepare children to join the labor market in order to nourish the global marketplace, which is driven by corporate needs and vested interests, all under the new guise of sustainable development. So this is in contrast to framing the learning crisis as children's inability to engage in planetary thinking, for example, which would affect their ability to become stewards of the environment and of the non-human world. So where learning is concerned, the discussion has been dominated by skills, workforce, and economic returns. Where the education sector has been making inroads in their efforts on focusing on greening schools. So this is mostly addressing the energy efficiency of school buildings, for example, or in building disaster risk reduction and preparedness within school systems. Missing is the radical reimagining of the purpose of education, one that is driven by transformational learning and oriented towards climate action. So this brings me to the third roadblock, which is a big and substantive one. This is the one where it asks questions about what should education be about? What is quality education in a time of climate breakdown? And the answer is that it isn't just any kind of education about climate change or any kind of education about sustainable development that we should be aiming for. In order to achieve the massive shift in orientation, behaviors, and social and economic structures that we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, we need a massive rehauling of education that rejects human exceptionalism and the dominant development paradigm of unfettered growth as the ideology that runs the system. Education for sustainable development, as it currently manifests itself around the world, suffers from a problem of definition and scope. And the root of this problem is that the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development took off before the global education community reached a consensus, not only about what sustainable development should look like, but what an education for that vision of the future should be about and how it should be approached. This created a cloud of ambiguity as to whether ESD was meant to be an orienting principle or as an academic subject. And as a result, it failed to be either. To give you an example, current iterations of ESD tend to be focused on a normative vision of the world in which sustainable development is the new frame to the old status quo. So while efforts may be directed at increasing student sustainability literacy or climate literacy, change is centered on low impact actions like recycling or turning off lights. Such an approach is at odds with the type of transformational learning that is needed to bring about rapid and impactful change. When we look at what studies suggest might lead to such transformative change, it may not come as a surprise that such an approach to education redefines what constitutes a quality education. So for instance, rather than being teacher-centered, it's learner-centered. Rather than being transmissive, it's transgressive. And then rather than being textbook-based, it's problem-centered and solutions-oriented. Moreover, because transformational learning is highly political and boundary pushing without a clear consensus on what ESD is and what the purpose of it is, implementation within our current systems becomes nearly impossible. It's also easier to fall into the trap of focusing narrowly on climate science, sanitizing and then depoliticizing climate change from the ethical and the affective dimensions of the underlying drivers of inequality and injustice that have fueled the environmental exploitation and destruction of yesterday as well as today. So in short, without clearly stating what we mean when we demand quality climate change education or when we're demanding for education for sustainable development, what we end up with is education that is oftentimes about sustainable development rather than for sustainable development, and education about climate change, not for climate action. We need both of these to really bring about the change in society needed. So the fourth roadblock comes around when it comes to monitoring progress towards climate action by the international community. Here, we see that monitoring mechanisms don't necessarily provide bold enough benchmarks by which to hold governments and the global education community accountable to the health of the planet. So for starters, SDG 4, which is the compass that guides the education sector, SDG 4 doesn't mention climate change at all. Instead, all climate relevant concepts are subsumed under a broader target, 4.7, which is listed here on the left, which is focused on sustainable development, global citizenship, gender equality, and human rights. So it's sort of become what the education sector calls as a kitchen sink target. So outside of the vague sort of conceptualization of ESD, measurement indicators that are associated with this particular target are focused on science knowledge, again, pointing back to the education sector's narrow focus on climate science. And even then, the measurement framework is focused on prevalence rather than substance. So measuring whether or not ESD has been adopted by policy and curricula and teacher training, and teacher education, rather than on assessing whether the substance of such ESD is oriented towards action and towards changing the status quo. The one place where the SDGs does mention climate change and education together is under Goal 12, which is focused on sustainable consumption and production. And SDG 13 on climate change also contains a target that's focused on ACE concepts of education, awareness raising, and capacity building. But these are focused on disaster risk reduction and frame education as a means to building capacity of people to then successfully implement another sector's mitigation or adaptation strategy. So again, sort of not really thinking about education as a quality education to inform further climate knowledge, climate awareness, climate action. So in addition to the low bar set by the SDG framework, the fact that data have not been collected for these indicators thus far, we're now 5 years into the SDGs, this means that we have little diagnostic information to guide the education sector over the next decade. Things are no different from the climate policy side of things either. In the analysis of NDCs that my colleagues at Plan, UNICEF, and I conducted, we found that while 68% of NDCs reference education, only 26% do so in reference to primary and secondary school children. So again, this illustrates the poor extent to which the global ambition for education as an action for climate empowerment has not quite been translated into policy. And such a gap also removes an important opportunity for monitoring progress toward the climate education ambitions, but also holding actors accountable to achieving those education visions within the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So finally, if transformative learning for climate action is to happen, teachers will ultimately be the ones to help facilitate this. Efforts to implement climate change education, or ESD, however, are often solely targeted at the teacher, placing the onus of change squarely on their shoulders. Without sufficiently adopting climate action or sustainability principles throughout the organization and the culture of the school, efforts to change the teacher are no doubt going to fall short. And this is especially the case where the education system does not support teachers to be the change agents in the first place. So I think many of you are probably familiar with this study, this series of studies in the US that show that while 86% of teachers think climate change should be taught in classrooms, only 42% actually do. And then the other statistics are even more, alarming. But such avoidance and sometimes even the misteaching of content is likely to be a result of teachers' own knowledge gaps due to limited training, as well as to low levels of professional resilience, adaptive capacity, and their own sense of place and environment. Currently, little data exists as to how many teachers are actually receiving climate change or ESD training during pre-service and in-service training. Or how many teachers are receiving training on how to respond to misinformation in the class or during parent-teacher meetings, or how many teachers utilize climate change teaching and learning resources that have been developed by UN agencies and other NGOs. I think the existing research suggests that such training and support is likely to be minimal, if not non-existent. And then, of course, all of this is not helped at all by the fact that corporate interests continue to distribute fossil fuel industry-sponsored teaching and learning materials into the classroom. Nor is it helped by the fact that only 20 states and Washington, D.C. Have adopted or I should say in the US, I know folks on the call are around the world, but only 20 states in Washington, D.C. and the US have adopted the US's our next generation science standards, which do include a reference to climate change. While also a dozen or more states have adopted or have proposed legislative measures that either ban teaching of climate change in the classroom or requires teachers to teach the controversy. So what next? So before moving to our discussion, I wanted to lay out 3 next steps that I think are necessary, but would love to hear your thoughts and reflections based on where you sit in the education and climate change nexus. So the first one is a big task, building consensus on a set of principles for radical transformative visions of education in time of climate crisis. While a major roadblock for the education sector that I highlighted earlier is a lack of radical vision around the purpose of education, the solution isn't necessarily that the global education community and its stakeholders can or should arrive at a consensus on a single vision for education. And in fact, the transformative vision for education shouldn't be global at all, but rather be locally defined by communities based on context and need. But what we can come to consensus about is a set of principles that are anchored in human rights and social and environmental justice that can guide communities, whether that's the national community, continental education systems, or a county, and really help to orient that education towards meaningful, impactful, and transformative climate action. But the underlying thing we have to bear in mind, however, is that the transformation of education for climate action is a systems issue. So no one single intervention is going to work. So this brings me to 2 points I want to make on the entry points for coordinated action across the education system, as well as across other sectors. So first, the 5 roadblocks clearly highlight that structural change is needed within the education system. And without a radical vision of ESD, governments will continue to lack the scaffolding on which to prioritize education for climate action, including whether or not they allocate resources to teacher training or to curriculum development or whatever, right? This has a downstream effect of creating confusion in the classroom around how to teach climate change, how to approach issues of climate justice, and how to deal with things like eco-anxiety among children. But looking at the systems level change that's needed is quite a mammoth of a challenge. And it brings me to the second point that I want to make, which is a conceptual one. I think also many of you on this call might be familiar with the Powers of 10 framework, which was developed by Avit Bomick and your very own Mark McCaffrey and Abigail Reske, as well as Chad Frischman and Owen Gaffney. So given the extent of the climate crisis and the multitude of solutions available to us, Bomick and co-authors' work suggests that there may be a particular population scale of action in which local action and global impact on climate is optimized. And specifically, they find that action between groups of 10,000 to 100,000 people, or at scales between community and cities, depending on the country context, might be the quote unquote sweet spot for climate action. And of course, Mark can jump in later to correct me on this. But if we apply this framework to the education system, education and climate actors may be able to better identify the right entry point for the right interventions by the right set of actors. Now, of course, this model, as it applies to education-related action and levels of education systems, need to be verified by research. It nonetheless demonstrates how the education system provides clear entry points for education-related climate action at multiple scales. So in this figure, I've adapted and applied Bomick and colleagues' framework to the education system, beginning at what you'll see at the bottom is the classroom and moving through the school district and county levels, through the national, the regional, the continental, and all the way up to the global education system level. And if we were to include non-state education providers, which includes private schools, as well as the informal education sector, this figure would probably look a lot different as well. So this is all to say that more research is needed to understand if the education's sort of sweet spot is similar to other kinds of interventions that the authors modeled, which if it was aligned with that, would place the sweet spot for climate action at the school district and school county levels, rather than at the country level. So, such a framework could really help break down that mammoth of a challenge of galvanizing the education sector to bolder action. And finally, some concrete next steps would be to develop clear guidelines and how-tos for decision makers who are this year in the midst of revising their NDCs and who might also be taking stock of their progress towards the SDGs and who are really eager for tools that will make their work coordinating action across sectors a lot easier. So I think I'm going to stop here for now. I'm eager to hear your reactions, your critiques, and your questions. And then here is a link for those of you who might be interested to the full report for your reference. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then turn it over to, I guess, Mark, or am I supposed to turn it over to somebody else?
Great, thank you very much, Christina. And we will now stop the recording so that the people who weren't able to attend this call can look at the recording later, but